The last 2 weekends, we heard some of the parables of Jesus. The parable of the sower, the parable of the weeds and the wheat, the parable of the mustard seed, and the bread and yeast. A parable, as I mentioned a couple weekends ago, is presented to us as a kind of almost puzzle to grab our attention, to excite our curiosity, and ultimately to help us remember an important spiritual lesson. And so this weekend, we have 3 final parables from this cycle of Matthew's Gospel before we continue on through the Scriptures. We have the treasure, the pearl of great price, and the net that's cast into the sea. So what is it? What lesson is Jesus trying to teach us? What does he want us to remember from these? Well, we can start with how each of these parables begin. It begins by him saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like." So, Jesus is trying to explain to us through these parables what heaven is like. Explaining what heaven is like is actually not necessarily an easy task, since those who have experienced heaven personally, in order for them to do that, they had to die. So they're not here to tell us about it. Sometimes saints were given certain heavenly visions, or we might hear about somebody who has some kind of near-death experience, and they get some kind of glimpse, perhaps, into what heaven might be like. But ultimately, somebody who's received the fullness of heaven, they're so united with God at that moment that it's impossible for them to return back to their regular life that we have here on earth in this valley of tears. So just to start off with the definition, we could say that heaven is for those who die in God's grace and friendship and are perfectly purified. That's who heaven is for. It's the perfect life with God. It's a real sharing in a communion and friendship with the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. That's what we call heaven. We also sometimes call heaven the beatific vision. It's the beautiful vision, or the blessed vision, in which we see God finally face to face. We know him to the extent that us limited human beings can know God, the Almighty. All sin, all shortcomings, all the pains and sufferings of this life has been completely eliminated by God's love. And heaven is really something that we literally can hardly put into words. And so Scriptures says that eye has not seen, nor ear has heard, nor thought of man conceived what God has prepared for those who love him. What we know here on earth doesn't compare to what the reality of heaven will be like. And so Scripture uses various images, like we have in the parables, but other images as well, like heaven is life, it's light, it's like a wedding feast, or the Father's house, or the heavenly Jerusalem, or paradise, to try to help us begin to grasp what heaven is like. And the need to explain what heaven is like is especially important for our time, our era today, because fewer and fewer people believe that there is such a thing as heaven. About a week ago, Gallup does all these different polls. They did another poll. They released the poll upon religious beliefs of those here in the United States. It found that back in 2001, 83% of Americans believed in heaven. And today, only 67% of Americans believe in heaven. Related to that, over the same approximately 20 years period of time, belief in hell also dropped from 71% of people believing 2001 to now only 59% of Americans believing that hell exists. And even among those who identify as Catholics, even that has gone down. Just 76% expressed a belief in heaven now, and 61% in hell. Of course, how active that person who claims to be religious is also matters a whole bunch. For those individuals who attend religious services weekly or even monthly, their belief in heaven and hell was up to from 80 even to 90 the percent belief. But for those who attended service less than monthly, their belief in heaven and hell plummets to 48 to 41% of those who believe in it. So there are many individuals who do not believe what Jesus is describing, that don't even believe that heaven exists at all. And there are undoubtedly been many factors that have played to this loss of faith in our culture, the loss of faith in God and this decline in the belief of both heaven and hell. But one error that may have led to part of this loss of believing in heaven and hell is an error about heaven and hell if we don't listen to what Jesus says. An error that we begin to think that everyone at their death automatically goes to heaven. That's what happens after everyone dies. Because a good God couldn't possibly send someone to hell to suffer for all eternity. That's what the argument says. And sometimes we even fall into that trap. For example, at funerals, sometimes, we talk about the person that we know with certainty that they're already in heaven, that they're basically a living saint. Even though, do we really know that they were? Well, how does this play into the loss of understanding or the loss of belief in heaven and hell? It makes us understand why you wouldn't believe in hell anymore, right? Because a good God wouldn't send anybody there. But how does it lose someone to believe in heaven as well? Well, if you think that there are no eternal consequences and everyone goes straight to heaven no matter what happens, no matter what we do or how we live, well, then why bother living a certain way? Why bother coming to church? Why bother spending time in personal prayer? Why bother having a relationship with God at all if it really doesn't matter after we die? We all go to heaven anyway. So that will lead someone to basically stop practicing. And slowly over time, if you think and act and do things that lead you to God less and less and less, you're going to think about God, about heaven, about all these things less and less and less. And ultimately, it will lead somebody even just to stop believing in all those things, period, at all. Because ultimately, it doesn't really matter at the end of our life. We can see that, judging from society, that really ends up being the case, since so many have lost that belief. So for us, who hopefully we're among those who believe, that's why we're here, we do believe in heaven, Jesus' parable says some very important things for us to consider, so that we know what heaven is all about, so that we interact with those who don't, we can express why we have this belief. He says that heaven is like a net that catches fish of all kinds, the good and the bad, and that the angels at the end of time will separate the good from the bad, that there will be a judgment. That tells us that heaven isn't automatic for us. As I already said earlier, heaven is for those who die in God's grace and friendship and are perfectly purified. So unless all of stain of sin, no residue of evil whatsoever can be left over within our souls, even the smallest of our venial sins have to be cleansed away first before we can reach heaven. And from Jesus' other two parables, it also teaches us that to allow him to do that in us will require work. Work because it is for something that's worth it. So he says that heaven is like a treasure buried in a field, or it's like a pearl of great price. Now notice that there's work that has to be done by both of those individuals. The treasure he has to go out and find it first. And the pearl, too, he spends time searching, looking for that pearl. So there's effort and work that has to be done. It's the same way for us in order to be with God forever in heaven. We have to live a certain way. There's effort to put in. And then he says in both cases, once they find this great treasure, once they find this great pearl, it says that they sell all that they have in order to obtain that treasure. And that's the same way for us. That there is a price, a cost. What are we willing to give up to reach heaven? What maybe right now are we willing not to give up? What are we holding back? Because that would be a question for us. Can we afford it? Can we afford heaven if it costs us something? Do we have enough to obtain this treasure? And to answer that, I want to give another kind of parable as well, to maybe kind of image this. So there's this homeless man who approached a jewelry shop. He had heard that the owner of this shop was actually giving away some of his finest wares. And so even though this man, he looked like dirt and he smelled like the gutter, he walked into the shop. And the jewelry owner treated him like a prince. And he laid out all of his finest things for him. And the man's eyes grew wide as he pointed to this pearl beneath the glass. But the owner asked, "How much do you have?" And the homeless man was stunned. He couldn't speak. The others said he'd give it away. And shame engulfed him. "I can't afford it," he muttered. And he started to go, but the owner stopped him with his hand. "I didn't ask you if you could. I just asked how much you had." So the man emptied his pockets, which contained the remnants of his life, a cap from a beer bottle, a picture of his ex-wife, some loose change, and some tissues on which he had cried. And with all this garbage laid out before him, the owner's eyes grew wide. "It's a deal," he said with glee. The man was stunned. If it were free, that would be one thing. But for this, the owner seemed ignorant in bliss. You see, no matter what our lives are made of, whether we have things of this life that we cling to because we think they're pearls, or there's other things that we're ashamed of because they're trash, Jesus wants to take it all. See, heaven isn't automatic. It comes with a price. For Jesus, it was the price of his very life. And it comes with a price for you and I as well. But it's one that's affordable. Because what he wants is you. Just as you are right now, he wants you. He doesn't want you as you are so you stay there. He wants you as you are so he can transform whatever it is that is part of your life, so that whatever might seem to be trash or is trash can be transformed into treasure. And so if you give Jesus yourself, that's when he exchanges it for the treasure, the pearl, the one of great price. All these things that we offer to him, he can transform us to be more like himself. And so Jesus calls us each day to strive to give your whole self to him. Whatever it is that we cling to, that we don't want to give up, that we want to hold on to, are we willing to give that up so that we can obtain heaven? We may not be there in every aspect of our life yet. We might still be attached to many other things besides him. So give Jesus those things because he wants you. Soon we'll offer the gifts there at Mass, the bread and wine, to the Father. And so place yourself, all those things that you have in your life, place them with those gifts, and Jesus will take them to the Father, and then he will come and give you that treasure that is beyond all price. Let him know today, Lord, I want nothing less but you.